that to me just led me to this idea that your intuition really is the source of life, and really I think it's the connection to the divine, and I think it moves life forward in every situation. And I think that's just listening to this complete conviction that gives you an ability to say no to all of the external influences around you because you're listening to what is within you.
The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vitruvian Podcast, a podcast centered around self-mastery. I'm your host, Zach Shankin. Today, I'm joined by Nate Lawrence. Nate is a student of bioenergetics, a Ray Peat enthusiast, a clear thinker, and a young philosopher in his own right. I'm beyond excited for and grateful for our conversation today. Nate, welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you, Zach. I appreciate it, bro.
Yeah, it was awesome to connect the other day over Twitter. I think I've met a lot of really incredible people and thinkers. It's continues to be my favorite platform, even though um, the audience, I guess, hasn't really grown particularly. I'm almost like treating it solely as like a networking app. Like the people on there are just so, I don't know, there's such a really, really strong community. And because it is like an ideas first application, it's not like flexing any sort of lifestyle, although, of course, there are those people. I get to meet and connect with people like yourself. And it's cool that you got to, obviously, we connected over you hopping on that brute space, which was cool to see. And I think hearing your competence and like depth of thought with a lot of different kind of philosophical topics, I could tell that you weren't just, regurgitating platitudes and you had actually thought through a lot of this stuff for yourself. So I wanted to connect and hear a little bit more about your world.
Yeah, appreciate that, bro. Well, it was cool because like I think I mentioned, like I noticed that a while ago when I found Brute, we had a lot of connections, and I don't think many people really saw the philosophical lens of Brute, and I was so surprised by that. So I wrote a few threads about that. Because before that I was already posting a lot. I think I started posting on Twitter around it was like maybe March of 2023. So I was just kind of getting into really just the bioenergetic ideas and Ray's work. That was really the thing that got me into posting. And I actually was posting stuff in the past. I was actually working on clothing, like probably about like 2 years ago. And then my health essentially just fell apart. I think I was always interested in health, but I did not have any sense of the issues I was dealing with. I was getting crazy hair shedding, bloating, just it got worse and worse, acid reflux, digestive issues. And it pretty much took away my function for the better part of the 2021, all the way up until even 2023, early 2023. But that whole time, I think it was really just me trying to get a feel for like Ray's work, because I kind of found his work from Danny Roddy. So he actually posted a lot of content regarding hair loss, and that's how I found out that I was probably like hypothyroid. That's really the main focus of Ray's work, is the thyroid and metabolism, and that can really be seen as the systemic energy production, and your heat, the heat that you give off is really the way to measure your metabolism. So like one of the things that I was experiencing was crazy intolerance to cold. I'd be freezing cold, cold extremities, and I just saw all of this correlating with the digestive issues and the hair shedding and bloating. And it was hard to piece together what to do with that information. But Danny, his content really directed me in the right way, I think. And then I started spending a lot of time on the Ray Peat forum and just different forums. People always talk about how insane it is on the Ray Peat forum, and I fully agree with that. But really, that was the only thing that could give me any answers regarding my issues I was dealing with. So it was almost every single day for I couldn't even tell you how long, probably a year to 2 years, just researching how I could improve my issues. And I wasn't really able to do much other than that. All of my creative ideas, all of the projects that I was working on pretty much just fell apart. And I think that that was actually a big part of my issues in the first place. I was just completely overstressed with that. And I was really the only one committed to what I was doing with the clothing. I mean, I was doing it with friends, but it was just a thing that was I needed to learn it was just mine, because my friends couldn't really commit like me. And I think that was part of the, thing with the health issue starting. But really, like, as I was learning more about Ray's ideas, I started realizing that I had a pretty good grasp on it, and I was starting to see improvement slowly but surely. And I was actually able to kind of get back to who I felt like I was. It's really like I was not able to access myself. And that to me, when someone experiences that, there's really not words that you can describe it, but it really feels like you're in quicksand and life is just picking at you. And it was just slowly but surely that I was able to inch out of that, and just each step that I took, it just kept leading me towards this idea that just my intuition is the guide in every life circumstance. And that became the biggest thing for me that I focused on, really just leaning into my feeling, my natural instinct. And like I always knew that the standard recommendations, just from seeing doctors and different gastroenterologists and people like that for my issues, none of the recommendations that they gave were helpful. And I intuitively knew that. And they said, you know what, you just got to keep sticking with it. Maybe you need to do this every day. Maybe you need to do that. Maybe you need to take Miralax every day. Maybe you need to take this medication. And really, I instinctively knew the entire time. I intuitively knew that it was not working. And I really knew that I needed to listen to myself. But it takes energy to do that. And that's what Ray, I think, his framework provided to me. But really, it takes a while for something like that to upregulate. So it was a little while where I was just like kind of just barely inching on, but I was making progress. And that's when I started posting. I just decided one day randomly to start tweeting, and that was at a point where I already had a pretty good grasp of things. And I just thought it was pretty much therapeutic to tweet and just share my ideas, share my thoughts. And I think I started actually just replying to a few guys in the space, because there's just a lot of people that share a extremely similar experience with health, in the Pete sphere essentially. And that to me was what really drew me in. It's just such a hyper niche, but really it was just amazing to connect with those type of people. And from there, that's really when I started posting, and then my account just slowly started growing. It was like I had my ideas before Ray. I kind of always wanted to do what I'm doing now, but I didn't really have the means to do that. I didn't really have the energy to do it. That's kind of my big thing, is that I knew always what the point of what I was doing was, but really energy was the only thing missing. And it was like I'd get halfway through these ideas, or I'd get halfway through something, and it was always the point of I'm disciplined. I'm putting an effort in. I don't understand what the problem is, and the problem is always that I just didn't have the metabolism, didn't have the energy for it. And that was just the most enlightening idea, because I see a lot of people who have so many issues and think that it's a lack of discipline or a lack of effort. And I think that's almost never the case. And that's what it's been for me so far. And it's just been great, because I actually feel like I can speak and naturally work at things now. And that has just been so liberating. So I kind of just went on a huge rant about that. But yeah, that's kind of my story, how I got into all this. But yeah.
No, that's good. It covered a number of questions that I was planning to ask. So you did a great intro for yourself. But it begs the question, I think, or at least I'm curious about how one goes about starting to, as you continue to like allude to this inching process, like you're getting back and starting to like recalibrate that metabolism and gain those energy levels back. Because arguably, whatever practice it is in its consistency demands that level of discipline like you're talking about. So it seems to me it's creating kind of a chicken and an egg situation, right? Where you're like you need the energy to do the thing, but you're also going to need consistency and discipline to do the things necessary to raise your energy levels. Can you kind of open that up a little bit?
Yeah, it's like that to me was something difficult to work with, because I knew when I leaned into things that I was being recommended, that they were making me worse. I think a lot of people always get told, oh, you just got to stick with it. It will get better. It will get better. And that was not the case in a single situation regarding my like gut health and whatnot. And that to me just led me to this idea that your intuition really is the source of life, and really I think it's the connection to the divine, and I think it moves life forward in every situation. And I think that's just listening to this complete conviction that gives you an ability to say no to all of the external influences around you because you're listening to what is within you. And I think that to me became what an idea of discipline was. I think discipline just happens from following your instinctive, intuitive feeling, and it was like that was a difficult concept because I think a lot of people have this idea that intuition is just going off of feelings. I think intuition is the complete opposite of feelings. I think it's completely rational. And I think feelings are fleeting, and I think those are more in line with stress and with your circumstances. I think intuition is completely outside of that. So that was like a big eye opener for me as I was kind of putting it together because it was hard to, kind of not listen to the people around me who were telling me that, it will get better, or telling me, oh, you kind of got to go through it if it really sucks and just keep putting yourself out there. I didn't really even want to be social. I didn't really want to do anything fun. And there was real reason for that. I actually benefited from not trying to force myself into situations that I didn't want to be in. And it's so hard for somebody to understand how that is going to work. But really, it's like all anxiety from external influences in your life just falls away with intuition. And eventually you always upregulate. And that's what it's been for me. And all of the people in your life, I think, always will see. But it takes being committed to that sort of feeling, that natural feeling that you have. So yeah, I mean, there was a lot of times where I did have to push through, but it's not even said even like the effort felt like it took anything because I knew what effort would leave me that would lead me forward, and I knew what effort would debilitate me just intuitively. So that was a big thing, and it definitely is a difficult thing for a person to just jump into, just to listen to their intuition. It's difficult if you haven't been your entire life because pretty much everything in the environment turns you away from your intuition and tells you to listen to the expert, tells you to listen to reason, which to me are absolutely vital, but really they should be secondary to intuition. They should be guided by this intuitive feeling that you have. That to me is the whole picture that's missed in the modern environment. It's really turning people away from life and saying that your feelings, your cravings, your desires, your obsessions are wrong, and you shouldn't be listening to a single thing that you feel in your heart of hearts you should be following. And Brute had a similar sentiment with that. I think he said primal desires are virtuous, not sinful. I think denial of the beast within is pretend, and pretend is sin. That was what Brute said, and that to me just like really stuck out. Yeah.
I love that a lot. And, we talked on the phone before this podcast about a previous guest of mine, Riva. She talked about, she calls it the church of graphs. Like we've moved into this world where science has replaced God and following that interconnection to the divine. And it's almost like irrational or unreasonable to be listening to yourself, and something that you can't put on paper or quantify with a study is should be discarded entirely. And yeah, I think it is really difficult. Like you said, everything in society from our early programming, even to that of our parents, which is like teaching us how to interface with the world, all that they frame towards us is that, yes, like innately something is wrong with you, and you need to look up and out for direction and guidance and help, whether that be the government for direction on how to run your private life, or the medical industrial complex for how to fix some sort of physical feeling you have in your body. Um, when in fact, like all of the tools necessary, all of the direction, all of the information that's far wiser than any of those things are within yourself. But I think it also has another difficult duality, is that in parallel to all of these kind of structural issues, we've also increased the just ambient noise of the environment with content and social media and stuff like that. And I'm not somebody who likes to whine or complain on social media. Like I think it's an extremely powerful lever. Like I'm bullish on that world, and it's here for better or for worse. So there's no sense in complaining about it. But used unconsciously or unintentionally, it is something that continues to disconnect you from your intuition. I think you have to create that space and that stillness to really tap into yourself.
Completely. Yeah, and I had a tweet pretty similar to what you just said where I think that really what regulates your ability to interact with your environment or interact with particularly social media is what I was thinking about, that your energy is what regulates what you spend time looking at. You're not going to have control if you're low energy state. You're going to be scrolling, doom scrolling essentially, and anything that triggers a bad feeling, anything that triggers you pretty much, I think, do not know how to control yourself if you don't have energy. So that was a big thing for me, particularly when I wasn't in great health. Really, my Twitter journey, whatever you'd want to call it, was kind of guided by only going on Twitter when I felt at the highest state possible. And that kind of let me avoid all of the toxicity of the modern culture. And to me, that should be the focus. I don't think that screen time is an issue. I genuinely do not. And that's, I think, a really shocking thing to a lot of people. But I actually, like I think I said on the brute space, I think kids should be spending more time on their phones. They should be learning how to interface with reality through the internet. And I think the thing that should be considered is always the metabolism and always the health, because that's what allows you to really regulate what you are experiencing. Because if you look at this in the sense of the cellular level, you're able to assimilate what needs to be brought into the cell and you're able to exclude what needs to be kept out of the cell. That I think gets back to the idea. I really see a lot of these cellular all the way up to societal level. I see them in the same light. And I think that's a big thing that bioenergetics gave to me. And it's just a powerful way of looking at the world because once you really understand that all of these life processes are guided by the metabolism, guided by the metabolic rate of life, essentially energy. Energy is everything. That is the whole point. The flow of energy is everything. And when we can look at where the blockages occur in this flow, particularly digestion, particularly with anything that's impairing the ability to use glucose, that's, I think, where we find all of the answers to all life problems. People tend to think that looking at life in these metabolic terms is a little bit reductionist. I tend to think it's the exact opposite. I tend to think it's really what opens us up to these unexplainable ideas that we're never going to have a grasp on. I think it definitely is divine. It definitely there's higher level ideas that humans will never understand, but I think our way of interfacing with that is through bioenergetics.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely very compelling, and it's exciting to hear you talk about it because I can tell that it is so connected to yourself, like in an emotional and an energetic sense, like it is both within and without you, and it is like, you have developed this philosophy and like have connected it to the way that you live your life. Like it's more than a worldview, it's more than just a perspective or a knowledge base that you've created for yourself, but it's like an embodiment. Like you have truly taken that energy and put it into the body and used it in a generative sense. And that's what I wanted to get back to with the social media thing is, something that I talk about a lot is, yeah, I completely agree that screen time inherently isn't the issue, but it is percentage of time spent in a creative and generative state as compared to like pure consumption, because that balance, it must be weighed. I do agree that like whatever is meant to be retained is going to be retained, like the intuition, the higher mind, it'll hold on to what it needs to. And I think Brute talked about that as well. Like, he doesn't take notes or like any of that stuff when he reads or consumes stuff. He doesn't jot stuff down. Like he just trusts that he'll remember what he needs to. And I heavily, heavily relate to that. Like I've never been a big like annotator when I read. I just read and continue to consume, listen to podcasts. And then when I'm talking to somebody and then I have an idea, like I trust my brain to make the synthetic connection it needs to. Oh, this idea sounds like this, and I can just bring it in. And if I don't remember it, it wasn't meant to come up. But yeah, I think balancing the in versus the out and the consumption versus the creation is kind of the crux there.
Totally. Yeah, and to me that's like if you're looking at it at the metabolic level, it's like creation and consumption. It's the absolute spiral. It's absolutely the contrast. And I talk about William Blake just so much because Ray, his philosophy is really built on this creative view of reality that Blake sort of brought forward. And he saw all of these contrasts in nature and just in life in general. I think he said, without contrary, there is no, I forget the quote exactly, something about just contraries. That is life, essentially. And once you like realize that it's never about maintaining a perfect balance between each force. It's always about leaning heavily towards one that's generative and then keeping, to me, it's pretty much pro stress versus anti stress, that you lean into these things that are anti stress because we're always going to have stress. But stress is actually the stimulus that leads life forward. And it's like, I think consuming, I think it's definitely a great thing for people in the sense where if they are looking at something that can draw them forward, something that can bring them towards a ability to create something and kind of actualize it into like real matter, I think that's 100% a positive thing. But again, it always gets to the point when the balance is out of whack. And that's, I think, the whole crux of the issue with modern society is that this middle that Brute talks about, this middle class, this middle pay schedule, like the midwit, it's like all of it gets back to this idea that there's no polarity and there's no contrast. And really, I think contrast is where life exists. And it's I don't think it's exactly binary on the holistic level, but I do think that there's all of these contrasts, all of these relationships that add up to this bigger holistic picture. So yeah, I don't know. It's like I think it is totally about balancing it. But it's to me that the natural flow of energy is the thing that regulates it properly. Because I think looking at life in isolation and saying that one thing needs to be dealt with or the other thing needs to be dealt with, really the whole system needs to be dealt with. I think that's Ray's idea that energy and structure are interdependent at every level. Like that's the holistic view of life, really getting out of this reductionist thinking, getting out of this idea that there's one central source in life that everything needs to come back to. It's really like the ruling class, I think, is really what it gets back to. That kind of the matrix idea of like each individual is going back and feeding the source instead of working together as a creative unison. And yeah, I think it's difficult to like really view how that is working in Western society today. But I do think that there's eventually going to be a point where society is liberated in that sense. But who knows when that will be? But I think Ray tended to say that like it's probably not going to be anytime soon, but eventually life will probably regulate itself.
Yeah, I was actually thinking over the social media example, like putting myself in the eyes or the seat of somebody who maybe is listening to this or is in the state where they haven't found like, their gift to give the world. I talk a lot about people finding like their purpose and their mission, and something to share because I think aspirationally, a lot of people are like, yeah, I'd love to be able to create. I just have no idea what to create. Like what even would I share? And I was thinking for that kind of person, how do you tell them to balance the creation and consumption if they don't have anything to make? And at first it would be like, okay, you need to, balance your screen time with like holding specific space, but then it starts to feel like rigid and structured. And honestly, even if I'm retrospective on my journey, you just need to just triple down on the consumption, like lean so heavily one way that you've consumed so much that eventually some sort of thesis or some sort of version of art like comes out of you naturally. Like it really was not an intentional choice necessarily for me to start creating, I guess. Or it certainly was no conscious plan ahead of time. Like I guess it was a very intentional choice to start, but there was no like plan. It was just continue to read the next book, continue to see the next podcast, continue to consume to the point where you finally do have something to share. And it's hard to know what that like catalyst will be, the thing that gets your activation energy necessary, but you'll probably accelerate that timeline for yourself if you just double down. Like, how, okay, can I listen to a podcast a day? Can I listen to two podcasts a day? Can I read whatever? And if you're just following your natural curiosity and not being like truly degenerate and just listening to like, I don't know, like streamers or whatever, I think typically it'll end up with a positive backswing.
Yeah, like I think that nothing is ever wasted. I tend to think that everything that you accumulate essentially can always be used in the future. And that to me was something where like I had a time where I was dealing with all my issues. Essentially, all that I was doing was just reading and just kind of gathering knowledge, kind of gathering experience and things that I knew would be helpful to learn, but I didn't really have it directed anywhere at the time. And I wasn't really sure where that was gonna head, but it's like you're kind of building this um body of resources to leverage. And to me, got to the point where a year down the line or 2 years down the line, I'm calling back on these ideas that I thought that I wasn't going to be able to use, or I thought that I was wasting. And really, it's like there's always a use for what you've gone through, and it's just about accumulating that experience and being fine with it and really leaning into it, like you said. That's how it worked for me. But like I noticed that anytime that I planned anything, especially in the past, this was a big issue where I would plan things really concretely to the point where I would have everything just I'd only be able to get to the start. I'd only be able to get halfway through something, and I could never just fully complete it, fully actualize it. And that led me to the idea that plans and perfectionism and needing things to be a certain way really get in the way of this flow, of this like pretty much structure of reality that you really need to move with the times and just move with what's coming to you right now. You just use what's at your disposal, and you can't worry about what you have or don't have. You go with what you have. You make it work. But really it's like telling that to somebody isn't really advice. It's not advice. It's just something that happens to you. And to me it was like plans happen, discipline happens. All of these things happen when you're being driven by obsession and this like kind of vision that you have in your head. That to me is just finding the mission. And I absolutely saw that connected. The mission and intuition are really the same in the lens that it moves life forward effortlessly. It's this complete flow. And I talked about that with Brute. Because I think that's just really the whole framework of both of our philosophies, both of our views, you know?
100%. And oh yes, this idea that like nothing is lost. Like I think that's really really compelling, and I think it's super empowering too because everybody has this like we'll call it like a wilderness period, like where you're just very lost, whether you're going through say a health crisis or you get laid off of a job or you get out of a relationship and you haven't found the mission, you haven't kind of connected to that tether of intuition quite yet, and it can feel very defeating, especially if it's like a big pivot, say career wise, you've sunk X, Y, and Z amount of time into a university degree or whatever. It's easy to look at that in a defeatist sense and say I wasted it. But I think like you said, it's not advice, but it's important to highlight like stories um, that show that it is true, even on the grandest scale. Like somebody who's been very central to my personal inspiration is Steve Jobs, and he had like a great quote, like you can never connect the dots looking forward, but you can always connect them looking back. And his story even represents that very well. Like it wasn't just, a platitude that he launched off in a speech. It was actually like very emblematic in his journey. For instance, like his period of studying calligraphy, just because it was something that he was interested in as a liberal arts student, literally like stealing classes at a community college. He had no idea he was going to go on to found Apple and then completely change the way that computer interfaces worked with fonts and typefaces, but it was extremely core when it came to that place that he had all this basal knowledge that he could just pull on and all of this like references when it came to like he was working on Apple. And that's something that in the moment, I'm sure his environment was like, you're studying calligraphy? Like, what's that going to be doing? He was probably even doubting himself. Like, what is this really doing for me? Other than the fact that he was just following the best intuition and curiosity he had at the time. And it was additive, it wasn't taken away. In fact, it was extremely powerful when it came time to be implemented. And he didn't have to write the plan ahead of time. He didn't have to tell somebody when he was in the class of calligraphy, like, oh, I'm studying this to go implement it later in this world changing company I'm going to build that you don't know about yet. Like, it would be just, it's just like an asinine concept. But I think that, yeah, like for anyone who's in that quote unquote like dark place or like the wilderness, like you feel like you're kind of lost. Like, I love reframing the life happening to you to the life happening for you thing. Like everything that's happening right now, wherever you're at, is 100% for you and for where you're going. Like you may not be able to see the thing, but just try to keep that like your head up as opposed to down in the weeds and start looking for where this could potentially tether and connect you to the next part of your journey.
Yeah, totally. Like for me, I always just like it was always a concept for me of just perseverance. Just that just naturally was something I always gravitated to. And it's like I think that I always saw the light at the end of the tunnel, just in general in life, and I think that's a difficult thing for a lot of people. I think it's a lot of that comes innately, but really just leaning into this idea that going into the darkness is not going to actually do anything. You're still you. You're always still you. That's the thing that I think people miss. And yeah, conditions can become terrible. You can have almost zero control over yourself, but that to me is what actually brings out this end flow. I think that's the idea to me that just greatness emerges from sickness. And to me, it's like that is the whole idea of you need to have a reason. Necessity is the mother of invention. That to me is like life installs these mechanisms to make things necessary to occur. It's like that was like if you're left with no option, then you need to follow your intuition. That was how I found like pretty much the idea. It's like I had no other option but to lean into my intuition. I couldn't really do much. I couldn't really think really clearly. And the whole process started building itself. Yeah, and it's like again, it's so funny because I talk about like it's not really advice, but it's like something that a person finds themselves, and you can kind of support someone on that path. Like I really like Ray talked about this psychologist Carl Rogers, and really his idea. He was a therapist. He had this focus on client-centered therapy, and it was essentially this idea of supporting someone and being positive and positive and supporting whatever they're tending towards, and really just having their path of knowledge be at the center front, not recommending anything for people, really just supporting their own discovery. That to me is, I think, the whole concept of this decentralized system of life, this really free spirit that's innate to everyone. But again, when you're in the modern environment, that's the exact opposite of this artificially imposed slow system. But yeah, really, you can just get around that by listening to your intuition, I think. But
Yeah, it's interesting, and it brings to mind something that I have been and consistent and continue to wrestle with as like a working thesis, and I'm tending in one direction, especially as of late, but I've always wondered like, is a tremendous amount of pain and suffering necessary to create great art? Like I want as the optimist to believe no. And so I've always kind of explored it like, is it possible? Like, can you circumvent the suffering period and still create something great for the world? But the writing's on the wall, right? Like all of the great artists of all time have these like crazy stories with like whether it's personal grief and suffering or toxic relationships with the substance. I mean, like you can go down the list. I mean, it's just insane, right? And it's why we see a lot of these artists throughout time potentially take their lives because they lose that kind of battle to depression or whatever they're particularly struggling with. But then they end up creating these indelible works of art. And so I've always wondered, like, does in every person's individual journey, pain have to be necessary for them to create something great out of themselves or their life? And I kind of at this point have landed on thinking that pain is just it's the universe or God's change agent to raise your self-awareness. Like the lesson essentially is guaranteed to be sent to you. And at first, it might just be like a nod or a whisper or a tap on the shoulder in the form of you read it somewhere, somebody gives you a piece of advice, and you have the opportunity to turn and listen to that. But if you ignore it, then next time it's like, it's like a punch on the shoulder or like a slap on the face. And then you have your another opportunity to like turn into the light and actually make the correction necessary. But if you turn away, next is a car accident or somebody beating the fuck out of you. And this is obviously like metaphorical, but I think that's like my current thesis, and I'm curious how you feel about the necessity for pain and struggle to bring about and catalyze change in someone's life.
yeah, I think that's interesting because I actually had a talk like a discussion with this with a mutual on Twitter about this, and he highlighted this idea that like a lot of the great artists of history, a lot of them actually, if you really dig into it, they didn't really suffer for their art, but they had to suffer to move their art forward. Then to me, it was this idea that necessity is 100% the mother of invention. As Plato said, I brought that up a little bit earlier. But to me, I don't think that itself is a struggle. I really don't. I think that art is ultimately guided by reaching for God and reaching for divinity. But it really doesn't matter what struggle, what stress you're going through. Ultimately, the innovator could not care what stress happens to them, what trauma that they experience. because really they're running straight through that towards this ultimate like light, towards this higher energy that they're seeing. And again, it's like to me, this like idea that like Ray focused on was that life, he highlighted this in his book, Generative Energy. That's Ray's main like book that kind of laid out his philosophy. And I wish I remembered exactly what he said, but it's something along the lines of life emerged pretty much spontaneously out of like carbon, and it was a volcano. I forget exactly what he wrote, but pretty much the idea is that if people realize that there's no struggle for life, what would that mean for the ruling class? That's pretty much Ray's idea, and I tend to like really align with him with that because it ultimately gets back to this idea of like what is the source of energy. And to me it's always this divine higher spirit that is ultimately youthful in nature. Like we talked about this on the Space with the Brute. He said like there's a quote from Heraclitus like the universe is a child at play with like colored balls. And I think that's kind of a good picture of it, but really like maximizing the youthful state is the entire core of Ray's idea. And he saw he saw evolution in the lens that life is tending towards higher consciousness, higher brain energy, higher levels of consciousness essentially is the main thing. And that's why I think he saw the infantile and feminine nature coming out in evolution. Like he said that our evolutionary future is infantile and feminine. So it's like to me that's this idea that like the infant has this high energy flow and ability to resist stress and metabolize everything. They have this high metabolic rate where they're really like functioning at a level that's imperceivable to a person that's older who has accumulated stress. And it to me, like everyone I think instinctively knows that like the youthful spirit, that irresponsible people are the most artistic people. Not in the sense of irresponsible as in they don't have a grasp of their reality. More so, they're leaning into their feelings. They're leaning into their intuition. I think is really the core of it. Like I keep saying, but it's to me this idea that like struggle is only necessary if you think about it. Like I think the bad art actually basks in the struggle, and I think the good art reaches far beyond it. Like that's kind of what I thought about it. But
Dude, I completely agree. And it's funny you say that because I've always had an aversion to like say OG era Gary V. Like you literally have to eat shit for 30 years and then you can start talking. Like that kind of concept to me, like hustle culture, grind, grind, grind. And we've seen like probably a downturn in that, but there still is always those people that like will get red in the face and scream at you on Instagram about like you gotta grind, you gotta want it. And all of those characters I've always found like so incredibly tacky. I always hated in sports. Like I played sports my entire life. I hated the coaches that would like yell at you. I always wanted them to just be like, "Hey, I'm an adult. Can you just give me like feedback on how to play better?" Like, so I've always had this like innate, intuitive feeling that was against the idea that it had to be hard. And I remember the first time, it was in an online mentorship that I bought into. Something like latched on and like completely connected to my psyche, and they were like, "What would this look like if it was easy?" You know, like nobody asks that kind of question, but I think it's so compelling anytime you find yourself in a bit of a jam, whether it is with your business or school or trying to make a hard decision, like taking a step back and saying, what if this didn't have to be a hard decision? What would this look like if it was just absolutely effortless? And you'll find that just like water flowing in a stream, like your brain, if you allow it to, will find a low friction path forward. And so I agree. And then I also think it's really compelling the idea of the infantile because there are so many different cultures. And even when you read with like an open eye towards a lot of the traditional wisdom texts, like even the Christian Bible, I'm currently like reading that now. And it's so funny how much of the core wisdom is trying to push you back to being like a child. You know, like even all the metaphors, like God the Father, you are a child in His hands, like all of these different, you're like the Lamb of God, all these different things that point at the idea that you are just a child at play and you can live as a child at play. Um, I think it's really, really compelling. There's something I heard from Deepak Chopra on a podcast once. He talked about like in his culture, which I believe is Hindu. I don't want to be like misquoted there, but specifically like his ethnic heritage, they treat life in these like big quartiles. It's like, you know, adolescence and then young adulthood, and then preparing for death. And so he said he's like now entering because he's like 70 something, maybe 80 something. He's entering that preparation for death. And like those two endpoints, it's like you enter the world like a child and then you return to it or you leave it basically becoming a child again, right? Like you start to become more dependent, you lose your faculties. But the idea is that at both of those endpoints, you have like a sense that like you don't care about your environment. And I think that that's really powerful. I was actually thinking about that yesterday because I was at the gym and you always see like those really old dudes at the gym and like, they've got their pants pulled up super high. They got their long socks, like, but they don't give a fuck what anyone thinks of them. They'll stare at somebody when they want to stare at them. They'll say whatever they want. They'll walk around the locker room naked. And I was thinking about that. And it's always like, as a young person, you're like, what are these old guys getting on about? But you start to realize the like true power and just not giving a damn. And the same thing is mirrored in the baby. Like a baby will just like waddle around in the world doing whatever it wants, touching what it wants, pointing at what it wants. Like, and then once they learn to speak, kids will just say stuff with no filter. And that I think there's like true magic in those two endpoints.
Bro, totally, totally. That to me was like so enlightening because like I saw the same thing with this idea that like the infant and the elderly are exactly the same. And in the sense to me where it's like they have the free spirit. They have like the way you go in is really the way you go out. Like to me, I think that is this whole picture of the middle needs to be avoided at all costs, and these polarities are really what drives life. And like we were talking about discipline a little bit earlier. Like you look at like the Gary V type hustle guys or like David Goggins, like a great example. I tend to think people like him are not actually forcing a single thing. I think they're being driven by higher energy that's telling them that they should do something within their spirit. And they're actually doing nothing that takes any effort for them. They're putting in effort, yes, of course they are. But really it's effortless. And that's I think the same thing that you see with the elderly and the baby. They don't care what they're doing in their environment. They're doing what they need to do, what they want to do. And like bro, it's powerful because I think people completely miss that. Like really the most disciplined people, if it was difficult for a successful disciplined person, they wouldn't be successful because they wouldn't be able to sustain it. Everything in life needs to be to the point where it's easy and simple to be consistent. I think consistency is really when something is so natural, so effortless that you don't even need to think about, oh, do I need to do this? Oh, do I need to lift? No, it's my nature. Like, you know what I'm saying? That to me was like the thing that I saw connected with the young spirit and the old spirit. They follow what they want to do. Like that's the whole thing. Nothing is being imposed on you. It's ultimately this like anti-authoritarian state.
Yeah, that I'm so glad that you ended on that because the idea and like the word that keeps coming up in my head is sovereignty, like wanting to just be truly sovereign as a spirit and an individual. And yeah, the Goggins idea, like I have a mutual friend, Ryan, he has a podcast and he's talked before as this idea. He thinks like he's positioned or posited that David Goggins is a monk. Like he has reached transcendence through kind of the physical endeavor, but he is as ascended or enlightened as somebody who's like meditating in the mountains. And to your point, I completely agree. Like David Goggins, he like, hammers on about discipline and like forcing yourself through hard things. Cause like I think that's the language and like it's the thing he's trying to convey to the masses because I think it's very digestible. But I absolutely think in his internal state, like he is flowing from the second he wakes up and like puts the shoes on and runs at 5 a.m. for however many miles. Like you can't tell me somebody, 150 miles into a 200-mile race is forcing the next step. They're just falling down forward. Like it is literally a gravitational pull in the direction necessary. And the idea that like, yeah, the sovereignty thing, it's something that resonates with me because I've always been, I hate to say anti-authority, but I've hated since I was like I have very young memories of it, like being in school all the way up through my entire life. It's why I'm an entrepreneur. But like I hate being told what to do, even if it's like somebody trying to tell me something that's helpful to me. I really resist the imposed structure. And I've always had this sense that like I know what I should be doing and I have this inner knowing. So I don't need somebody else to kind of tell me. And it's only in the last few years that I've really kind of connected to that voice, started listening to it and sharpening that relationship where, you hear the call of intuition, you test by listening, it goes well, and then you can kind of do that again and again. And you start to give yourself the evidence that the intuition is actually feeding you the right direction rather than the psyop that's been fed us, which is you need to be able to prove X, Y, and Z. You need to be able to logically point to why you're doing something before doing it, which in and of itself is almost like an extremely arrogant concept.
Bro, exactly, exactly. Like to me, I think that it was crazy to think about this in the sense that like really the disciplined person or the person who's the authority, it's like it's like we talked about this like Brute and I like the heretics or the people in opposition to all of the pretty much mainstream ideas they always are vindicated in the end, always. Like the contrarians really are the ones that have a closer grasp of truth because again nothing can be proven. You're right, it's like life itself is the proof, and that's the interesting thing with data. It's like anything that is data driven is, I think, essentially guided by a static view of reality. Yes, of course, the people who want to be driven by data, of course, there's value in that. But ultimately, it's intuition guiding that. It's like that's what I keep getting back to because I think people just take this view that data itself is really the force of life. When really that to me is like this idea that AI is like somehow more competent than human consciousness, and I really do think it's like a essentially the idea of giving into it to like anti-divinity. Really, it's that's I think what it gets back to, honestly. But
Yeah, and it's interesting. It, I think it's so profound the idea because I don't know the midwit, the people under the giant area of the bell curve, like it's just very very lost on them in the zeitgeist that science itself, by its nature, will always be a lagging indicator. Like the intuition, the spirituality, the like I mean, to form a fucking study, you have to have a hypothesis. That is literally an idea that is from your head about how things potentially are. And then you use the data to potentially corroborate, but it's always going to be a lagging indicator. And it's why I found it so funny. And myself and Revo were talking about this. She's like, I saw something on Twitter. She mentioned seeing something on Twitter about a study coming out talking about the cognitive benefits of going on long walks, and like it was really profound to people. And she's like, what kind of world have we gotten to that people need a study to tell them that it's probably a good idea to clear your head and go on a long walk? Meanwhile, all of the spiritualists throughout all of history have just walked their ass outside and come upon these massive like schools of thought, theories, eureka moments in science and philosophy, etc. And that's like a perfect example, right? Like Nietzsche walks the trail, creates this body of work, and then however many years later, 100 years later, we have a study that says you'll probably think a little bit better if you go on long walks. It's like a massively lagging indicator, and it's why I'm much more compelled by currently and excited by the idea of intuition, spirituality, and kind of that higher guidance, because it's always going to keep you at the forefront and ahead of the curve. And you don't have to wait for the data to back it up. Like, again, like you said, I studied biomedical engineering at school. I come from that technical world. So it's not lost on me the potential value, I suppose, because we don't want to just live in a world where we're denying objective reality. But at the same time, if you can take those quantum leaps forward in like acts of faith, and as long as it's not harming you, which I don't believe your intuition will ever lead you to true harm, that's not an expansive experience. I don't know. You just get a lot more out of life because you're not waiting for the lagging indicator to catch up to then give you the green light to start in the first place.
bro, exactly. Like to me, Ray had this great article that it was about William Blake. He said the title was "Can Art Instruct Science?" William Blake, a biological visionary. And really, Blake's work is just always highlighting this idea of invention and generation, and this idea that life is infinite. Really, it's like it's closed off to our senses. We only have five senses, of course, and really like the quote that I think gets back at it is like if man knew or if the doors of perception were cleansed, man would see what he is, infinite. And that was like a big one for me because like there's always things in life that are not true yet that will be true eventually. And I think that is what you get when you follow your feeling, follow your sense, follow your instinct, intuition. And that's ultimately what the innovator listens to. It's ultimately gets back to this idea of a generative reality, one that's of abundance, one that's overflowing and constantly creating, and one that has a scarcity and one that has a finite amount. Really, it's always this infinite flow. And I think like Heraclitus was really the first person who I saw in history that really focused on this idea of this constant change, this constant flow. And like he saw it in like the universe is all fire, everything's built out of fire. And ultimately to me, like fire, that's metabolism. And I think Georgy Dinkov, who's a bioenergetic researcher, he's a great genius guy. He actually, I think he posted something about that I need to touch up on, but like yeah, there's so much in my opinion to connect between this metabolic idea and this idea of this generative life and this force of nature with William Blake and even Nietzsche's work like yeah, there's so much to it, and it's a picture that I'm such a fan of, and I'm just glad that I can sort of bring it to light. But
Yeah, I love it as well. And, the Stoicism has risen in popularity in the past few years. And Marcus Aurelius talks about this idea of the fire as well, and connecting that Latin idea amor fati, like love your fate, like fall in love with every aspect of it, and treat yourself or imagine yourself or your life, maybe in total, as this fire. Everything you throw onto a fire creates the fire. Like it continues to grow and bellow and strengthen it. So even if you throw in something that's less than ideal, like not firewood, it's still going to be consumed by the fire and make the flame larger. So I think that is really, really compelling. And I love that it also ties in, at least in a metaphorical sense, to the idea of metabolism.
yeah, it's like that brings me into something because, like you said, anything you throw on the fire, it will kind of serve a purpose. And honestly, like that brought me to this idea of, of course, seed oils and PUFA. I don't know how familiar you are with like Ray's idea, but really the thing was like polyunsaturated fats, the excess consumption of polyunsaturated fats were really the first thing that we saw in history that was really lowering the metabolic rate of humans and lowering heat production, and this is when we saw the declining temperatures. And now temperatures of humans are completely in decline and much lower than they used to be. And we see all the chronic illness and chronic diseases. And it's really this idea that like anything that opposes the metabolic rate, anything that gets in the way of this energy flow should be avoided. Keeping the metabolic rate up is ultimately the main thing. That's kind of one of Ray's quotes. But like when you have like things in the environment that are introduced and kind of oppose nature, oppose this natural structure that builds, that to me is like there's not really even an answer that to look for like of why were these things put in the environment, why were health issues even a thing in the first place or whatnot, because we're living longer and longer, yet we're in worse health. People are unable to do as much as they want to do, have less autonomy over themselves, and really that to me just is a clear sign that something is wrong. And it's like these anti-metabolic things, really polyunsaturated fat was the first one where it's like we're consuming these seed oils, we're consuming these high levels of polyunsaturated fat that are burning in our that are accumulating in our fat stores. And when we burn them, they oxidize and impair metabolism, impair thyroid function. And that's like these blocks on energy. And that's like the big focus for me because like I do see that the physical energy flow is the mental, emotional, and spiritual flow. Like there's a reason that like the things that promote, I say this all the time. It's like things that promote physical digestion promote mental, spiritual, and emotional digestion. I mean, it's so clear to me. But it's just hard for people to get that sense until they've really experienced it. It's like that's the hard thing. It's like people don't even really realize the low level issues they're dealing with. And that to me is the whole picture to focus on. It's like dealing with these issues that people don't even perceive because I think ultimately there's only going to be a minority, small minority that's going to be able to have this knowledge. But it's up to people like that who sort of understand this metabolic view, understand this energetic view of life to kind of have the overcorrection of their environment. Like we had a like good discussion about this like on I made a thread about it. Like I don't think the average person will ever become like a Peter, so to speak, because I think it requires that they perceive, think, act, and that's not really possible for a lot of people. I think there's always going to be an innovator and there's always going to be a follower, or essentially William Blake's idea that there's always a prolific and a devourer, somebody that's creating work and people consuming that move forward the work of the innovator. And it's just an interesting concept to me because like so many people just don't really have a grasp of what they want to be doing. And I think that's completely natural, completely normal. But Yeah, it's interesting thinking about, I guess, you know.
It is really interesting, and I think that that is actually you're touching on one of the hardest things about being somebody who is the prolific or in the camp that could potentially create something that is prolific. And to me, a lot of that comes down to like levels of self-awareness, like literal consciousness. Once you've ascended past a certain place, you recognize that yes, you are infinite and in fact can impact the world in a really great way. So those that kind of break through whatever that barrier is, and I think it's different for each individual. And some people come in inbuilt, other people have to go through great pain. But once you're there, you realize that one, you're in a very, very small crowd. So it's like extremely isolating. And then the second thing is you look back down or back through, the glass, and you want other people to experience what you now feel, like true, empowered, physical, emotional, and spiritual vitality. Like once you're on your mission and you wake up every single day fired up and like metabolically and physically healthy to attack that goal, and then you can give to the world, not only from just the physical sense but all the way down to like the mission and what you're giving, the art you're creating. That feeling is, I've never done any sort of like hard drugs, but I can imagine that that's what drugs feel like, or it's even exceeding in that. And so you want to go back, especially to the people you love, like family members, whatever, and you're just like screaming. It's like you're hammering on the glass. You're like, don't you see? Like, don't you see what this is? Like, you can come here too. But to your point, there is some percentage of people that just won't. And that's not what's for them and what's for this version of them in this spiritual path. One thing that's given me some peace in that is that I know that everything is happening exactly as it should. And so, like, what is meant for them might not be, and almost guaranteed is not what's meant for me. And somebody who finds themselves and aspires to be amongst the prolific and like lead from the front and be generative, I think that's one of the harder pills we have to swallow, is that like you're not going to be able to bring every person you love into that space with you. And you just have to make peace with that.
Totally. Yeah, and it's like Root had a great idea about this is like anytime that, people have negative or like traits that they don't like about themselves, almost keeping your hands off of that and trying to actually lean into that. That's the thing of doubling down on your edge. That's Brute's one of Brute's whole ideas is like everybody has their innate degenerative processes that they're drawn to, but really leaning into it is the thing that stimulates, I think, life. And it's like if you were to like take the fat guy who's like really jolly and just has a fire in his belly, like that's what creates the food addiction, but that's also what creates the outgoing personality. It's like the social magistrate. Really dulling that down, I think, is the whole thing that we see now, where it's like these people with the ideas or these people who want to pursue really lofty goals, they're told to be come into the middle. No, 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 buddy, you can't do this. You can't have ADHD untreated. That's like Brute's thing. It's like that I think is the thing of telling a person who just doesn't really have a sense of what they want to do that they need to be working this artificial or this job that's imposed upon them that's not really even doing anything in the world. And to me it's like of course there's a value in having the blue collar labor and really like a person should relish in that. They shouldn't feel imposed upon to do, because like really that is to me the whole thing is just denying your nature. I think a person intuitively understands that, but yeah, it's like the whole I think thing about modernity is like looking at these comparisons. Like I think people always focus on this idea of looking at these cultural expectations or like what like the culture on social media. It's like these really high standards, beauty standards for girls or guys or whatnot. It's like to me, those aren't really the issue. I really see it as energy being the issue because, like I said, I think social media. I think you're able to regulate everything you consume in life and not have any like fear reactions when you really focus on the energy first. Like that's I think the thing of not needing anything to be a certain way. Like you really don't need anything in life to be a certain way at all. Nothing needs to be a certain way. And when you can give into that, I think that's when you're at the healthiest spot because ultimately life is coming to you effortlessly and naturally. Like I say, this is the whole thing, I think. And anytime that you need to force that into being, I think that's ultimately degenerating yourself. And I think that's ultimately decaying life in the most basic sense. But
Yeah, one thing I will push back on, or kind of curious to get your take on, though, is kind of the power of environment, because And I know that, it's typically going to be like all great questions, more of a duality to manage, like a bit of a paradox in of itself. But at the same time, like, it's very parochial wisdom. Like, surround yourself with people that are going to push you forward. You're the sum total of the five people around you. Like, curate your environment to be as expansive towards your goals as possible. And it's something where I personally have, as of very recently, like stress tested the idea that as an individual, I'm stronger than my environment. So like it doesn't matter where I am and I can just do what I need to do. But I've come to recognize like that takes a tremendous amount of energy when you're just trying to be and become something that's so contrary to where you are physically, like the people you're around, the physical environment you're in. And so it almost seems to me like more of a downhill approach to fix the environment. But by the same token, you're kind of like what you just said, like you don't need things to be a certain way. Where does that land with you, or where do you ride that duality on intentional curation of your environment, people, things, like physical location that you're staying in, versus only focusing on your kind of internal state, I guess.
Yeah, I think like something that I've had in my head is that like I think that really home is where your mind is. I really think your environment, that's ultimately where it stems. But like that ultimately takes energy to muster up. And I think there's absolutely 100% super important value in putting yourself in a place that is going to support your energy and structure. And like to me, I think that's like that it takes avoiding toxic people, it takes avoiding situations that you don't want to be in. And I think that to me is like this thing of like, it takes discipline to put yourself in a situation that you don't want to be in. That to me is a sign that something is usually wrong. And it's not to say that discipline is a bad thing, of course, like I said, but like really it's like discipline should happen, not be forcibly imposed. So like for me in particular, like putting myself around people who I aligned with really came just naturally. I didn't really force any of my relationships on Twitter. I didn't really DM anybody. People just kind of came to me, like once I was like really in tune with my nature, in tune with my mission. And again, intuition was the thing that led me there. And like when there was anywhere that like I felt like I was having a person in my life who just was not helping my cause, or essentially just kind of it was a negative thing for both of us or just a negative thing for me, it was like my intuition told me that, it's like okay, so I'm going to stay away from that. And you kind of have this thing where when you have energy, I think people who are toxic, I think you repel them. Actually, I think they don't want to be around you anymore. And that to me is why I had a tweet that did pretty big, is like I think that health is ultimately offensive. I think it's like you're playing offense with health. You like I said, I think you repel people, but there's 100% the thing that toxic people can still want to be around you, but that's ultimately like you don't want to be around them. It's like that I think is the thing of like looking at life on this cellular level where you're impenetrable when you follow your intuition. There's no thing that you can really or you shouldn't internalize any misery. You can definitely internalize misery, but I think it's like, following this flow of energy is the thing that just gets you past that. So nothing, no stress accumulates. Ultimately, I think trauma or just death in general, or just any decay is an accumulation of stress that you can't, that you don't have the energy to sort of detoxify or, metabolize essentially. That's really how I see it. And like whenever you're in this like toxic environment or around people who just aren't supportive to what you're trying to do, that's I think when you see this calcification and it's everything is becoming static and you're turning off function. And yeah, I think it's important to totally just avoid dull minds, avoid dull routines, avoid dull situations at all costs, honestly. So I think we probably agree more than you would think, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I like the idea that you kind of posited that it's actually taking more discipline to stay in a bad place, in a bad environment. Um, that's really compelling because it takes a really high level of honesty with self to admit that probably, right? Like you're staying in this environment and you're sitting there kind of whinging and complaining like, my environment's not like aligned with my goals, my whatever. But at the end of the day, you are a sovereign individual. And even though it may perceptively seem hard to like make that big trajectory switch, it would immediately then be given back to you in the form of vigor and energy and expansiveness. And it would solve all of the perceived problems. But that brings me to like a question that kind of came up in my mind as you were answering that, which is it seems like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is on the psychological plane. Like these are like reframes and perspectives to take on your environment. But I also know, and I know that you don't think this either, that you can't think your way out of problems, right? Like it's kind of the antithesis of the issue. Like you can't rationalize your way into intuition. Like the point is to stop thinking and just let the obvious happen. I'm curious how you would ride that duality though, because it seems like a lot of what you're talking about are these perspectives to take or reframes for your situation or mental models to install.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I'm actually glad you brought that up because like to me, I've been thinking a lot recently about this idea of mental models and sort of behavioral modification or thought patterns or intrusive thoughts. Oh, you need to not listen to. I tend to think that there is value in every single thought, and I think you can kind of trace back the origin of every single thought that you have, as in when you're in a stressful environment, I think it takes a lot, but you can definitely get a sense of where that voice or where that thought is coming from. To me, I think that stress ultimately absconds your ability to kind of make that judgment, but you still can. You can always judge where a thought is coming from. It just takes a lot to really trust your senses and look at your environment. That's the ultimate thing. It's like that's I think the ultimate like thing of like Ray's thesis or not thesis, but he was asked if there was like if there's one protocol like he thought it would be perceive, think, act. That to me, he was getting at intuition. He didn't really write much about intuition, but the few times he did, I think that's really what he was getting at. It's like trusting your senses and either getting this feeling of constricting in your environment, but or getting this feeling of outpouring. And really the outpouring is what you want to strive for in all situations. It's like it's super primal, it's super innate to us in the evolutionary thinking, but like again, all of the complexity of the modern world kind of turns you away from that.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's funny how much of the spiritual path, life journey, entrepreneurship, like all of these different verticals end up being so much more of an unlearning process than like a learning process. And it goes back to the childlike thing, right? Like you came in, you had it all. It was all right there. And then you had all this shit piled on top. One of the most important books to me personally is The Four Agreements. I read it 4 times a year because it's like so concise but so profound. And it talks about, what he calls agreements. It's like these contracts we make with our environment, with our world, with the people around us to agree to rules that they set up. Whether that be the words we use or the story we tell ourselves or let others tell us about us. And it's when you relinquish that control or like take it back, I suppose, into your individual sovereignty and deny those additional agreements that you really get to be very sovereign and personally expansive.
Bro, totally, totally. Like, because to me, it's like it's this just idea of detoxifying the stress, keeping the flow moving at all levels. And like again, it is the metabolism of the infant, of the baby, of the youth, and like it's so powerful because like really for me, there's not much more to focus on than physical flow. Really, like a lot of the life processes that people focus on are all downstream of this physical flow of energy. I think it starts with the sun and photosynthesis and plants, and it works with animals. And again, of course, humans can conduct photosynthesis on their skin or whatnot, or like they can receive energy from the sun. And like that was the ultimate focus for me is like just taking care of these things that people look at in like the Peterian perspective of like don't you think that, you should lend more credence to the idea of, thinking in cultivating a mindset of it's like it kind of people think that it's so reductionist. But again, like I say, I think it's the complete opposite. I really think it's putting all of the control that you have into like it's kind of the stoic idea of the locus of control, really like putting your efforts into where you have control over. And I think like diet and environment are really the things. Like I think Ray said something along the lines of like nutrition is like a political thing. It really is. It's like that to me is like a really big idea because like energy itself has become this commodity essentially of like only so many people can have energy or essentially like promoting against foods such as like beef, milk, and like easily digestible food and instead promoting a plant-based diet. Like that to me is like a big thing that Ray looked at because it's like that's the ultimately the anti-metabolic things like like you can really like boil these things down to like physical introductions in the environment and physical things that people promote. Like again, propaganda plays into this 100%. Of course, there's a psychological aspect, but really it always gets back to, well, what are we physically consuming? And you could say like, I think that like, yeah, social media or like what we're looking at, what's in our environment. I think that is physical consumption. I do, but I really think that like the food is one of the most important ones because really like I think our gut is the connection to our higher ideation, connection to the God essentially. Like Brute and I talked about this. Like I think that like your intestine is like your connection to the universe is what Ray said. And that to me, just like when I first heard him say that, it started making sense because we call it a gut feeling for a reason. And like the things then in the environment that promote irritation to the gut, promote inflammation, promote gut permeability, where you have toxins leaking into the bloodstream. All of this causes brain fog and takes away our ability to think. So then we need to rely on these experts, or we need to rely on this reasoning that ultimately is just anti-life, essentially. Like because to me, that's just what it always gets back to. It's like intuition versus reason, intuition, but it's like abundance versus scarcity, or flow versus impairment. It's like all these contrasts, but.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think we could go back and forth all day long, but I want to be respectful to your time and the listener as well. I've appreciated every moment of it. You may or may not be aware, but I have three closer questions that I ask every single guest on the podcast. So the first of the three is, if you could go back to a younger version of yourself and tell him one thing, what would that be?
Follow your intuition. That's it.
Do you think he would be ready to receive that advice?
I think so. I think it's like, yeah, I do.
Fair enough. I think that falls very in line with your philosophy.
Yeah.
Secondly, what is one quote that's always stuck with you or that you try to live by?
Oh, I think live in accordance with your nature. If that was a direct quote from Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius, I know it was they had either one of them had a very similar quote. But yeah, that was always a big one for me.
I love it. And finally, what do you believe is your unique gift to give the world?
Energy, intuition. That's really I think my whole thing is just promoting the flow of energy, really, like in every single sense. Because I think there's ultimately infinite ways to achieve energy, and just liberating that flow is just that's where my focus has been. So yeah.
Amazing. Well, Nate, I appreciate your time. This has been so fun. I'm glad that we're connected and we'll stay connected into the future. Where can people find you and what are you working on that you're excited about?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Nate Lawrence underscore, and then all other social medias, like Instagram. I have TikTok, but I don't really post on TikTok. And then my YouTube are Nate Lawrence GC. And yeah, I'm just working on a few videos, and I'm probably gonna have a video out on thyroid really soon, just like thyroid metabolism. That's probably gonna be a longer one, so that should I think be a helpful thing for people trying to get into the metabolic view and whatnot. So yeah, I appreciate it, Zach. This is great. So it was really fun.
Amazing, bro. All of your links will be in the description below. You've made it this far. You've heard us either on, Apple, Spotify, YouTube. Subscribe to the YouTube channel if you found us there for video. Also doing behind the scenes vlogs of building out this podcast and living the life that I am. So if that interests you, you can find that stuff there. You can follow myself at ZDSCHENKEN on Instagram and Twitter. But for those that made it thus far, thank you for spending your time and attention, your most valuable resources with myself and Nate today. Memento Mori, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Vitruvian Podcast.
And if he fails, at least fails while daring greater, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat.